Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the But What Does God Say podcast. Today, I am here with some lovely ladies to talk about male leadership from a woman's perspective. I'm here with my friend Laura.
Good morning.
I'm here with my friend Abby.
Hello.
And I'm here with my friend Kathy.
Greetings.
And we are super excited to talk to you about male leadership today. We have been planning to talk on this podcast for a while now, and we finally got a day that we could all get together and talk about this, and I'm really excited about it. I think the first question that I was going to ask is a two-in-one question. Essentially, I'm asking, what is male leadership, and where should there be male leadership?
I'll dig in. This is Kathy speaking. I think, first of all, it's important to go back to Genesis, where God creates male and female. And in Genesis 1:27, it said, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And so, first of all, we see that God creates man, both man and woman, in his image. And so we're image bearers. Secondly, in verse 28, it said, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And so we see that God made them co-regents. Both male and female were blessed and given the task to rule together over the lower creation. And so we see that there's God's beautiful design in the perfect world where sin had not entered yet. But even there in Genesis 2, we then see the leadership come through, that God created man first and in a significantly different manner than woman. Genesis 2:7 God says, then the Lord God formed man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. And it was a little later, after God had placed man in the Garden of Eden to cultivate it, told him not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Genesis 2:15-17, he then said, it's not good for man to be alone, so I will make him a helper suitable for him. Genesis 2:18. So God created Eve to assist Adam in ruling an undefiled world. Genesis 2:21-22. Upon waking, Adam immediately recognized her as his perfect companion, and they were in the perfect state. No evil, impure, or perverse thoughts that could exist because sin had not yet entered the world. The fact that Adam named Eve, which in the Old Testament was a privilege bestowed on those who had authority in the Old Testament, manifested his authority over her. So before sin entered the world, God in his perfect will and wisdom had designed male and female as image bearers, co-regents, but that there was a line of authority. So it was after the sin came in that we then have two people not loving and submitting to each other in harmony, but it then became more difficult. So it's a good design that God has in store.
I would agree with Kathy. Definitely it starts at the beginning with how God created man first and then woman, and how he designed them similarly but different. They were both made in God's image, but they have different roles to play. The man has one role to lead, and another role is for the woman to follow.
I don't have any background of male leadership in my family. So for me to speak comes more from a lack of, where if there was male leadership in the family, the household probably would have run much more smoothly, more happily, more productively.
One of my notes that I wrote down in just thinking about male leadership, one of the first things I thought of was, well, this is the way God created it. When Kathy and Abby have said, when God created men and women, God created the women to be a helper to man, and God created man first. And even looking to when sin entered the world and when they took fruit from the tree, when God came down to confront Adam and Eve about their sins, he went to Adam first, and he asked Adam to essentially own up to what happened. Even in God's design, he made it so that the men would be the leader. That's the way he designed it. And so male leadership was created by God. So in its nature, it's meant to be good.
That's what I was going to say. In the beginning, God called all that he created good before sin. And so before sin came into the world, God's creation he called good, and man's leadership was good, and woman following him is good. And even after the fall, after sin, it still is good, even in the sinful world. There's sin, of course.
Because it was created by God.
Yes.
That's what makes it good and continues to make it good, is because that is what God has put into place, and that's what God still expects in place. The next question is maybe more personal. Why do each of us individually believe in the idea of male leadership? A lot of times we hear a lot about women empowerment, but we don't hear a lot about the woman's perspective of male leadership.
I think because it continues throughout the Bible. In the New Testament, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 11:3, Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. I don't think we always get the idea in our heads that authority and submission characterize not only a creation, but of the Creator as well. Listen to that last part. God is the head of Christ. So within the triune Godhead, there is authority and submission. And if you think about it, the Father sent Christ to earth out of love, not coercion, to redeem the world. And the Son submitted to the Father out of love, not compulsion. Christ loves the church so much that he died for it, and he rules the church in love, not in tyranny. In response, the church submits to him in love. Likewise, men in general and husbands in particular should exercise their authority in love, not in tyranny. Their authority is not based on any greater worth or ability, but simply on God's wise design and loving will. Women, in turn, are to respond to their husbands in loving submission. And so I think we have to realize that we see examples of this in our nation. We have leaders in the military. There are leaders in businesses. You have people who are in authority. And there has to be, otherwise it'd be anarchy. So likewise in our church, we are supposed to obey our leaders and submit to them, for they keep watch over our souls as those who will give an account. Hebrews 13:17. I think similarly in our homes, as the husband is called to lead his wife, it's a sacrificial leadership. It's a servant leadership. And when they remember that they're going to give an account for how they have led in love, sacrificial love, purifying love, then it's weighty. It's a responsibility. It's a not woohoo, I get to do whatever I want, a bully kind of relationship, but it's a love and submission to their wife, because Ephesians 5:21, similarly, be subject to one another in the fear of Christ. So all of us as believers are to submit to one another in love, but specifically as a husband is to lead his wife, to protect her, to take care of her. It should be a cherishing kind of love, so that then it's an easy thing for the woman to say, I submit to you. But yet it's a co-equal, it's a team effort. It's not to be lopsided.
Speaking from a lack of biblical background and male leadership that isn't abusive, having the Bible as a base and understanding God being Jesus being submissive to God, God being the head, is huge in the family, and I understand the lack of that.
Yes, I think when the male follows what Christ has done and how Christ has submitted himself to the Father, and then how the husband is to submit to God and to what God has said in his word throughout the Bible, how one should live, both husband and wife, and if they are both striving to imitate Christ and follow him, then there should be no unbalance of one side or the other. When they do that, they balance each other out, and their home brings more glory and honor to the Lord. I think it's key to keep that in mind of how both, especially the husband, has that role to lead and lead in obedience to the Father, just like Christ did.
Yes.
Right.
I think a point to remember that Kathy touched on is remembering that this idea of male leadership is not meant to be in a way abusive in any way. Not only are the wives submitting to their husband's leadership, but the husband is submitting to Christ and to God, and in doing so loves his wife. I think it's important to remember that it's in no way abusive, and it doesn't mean that we don't have a voice.
You bring up a good point. So looking at the word submit, in the Greeks, the word is hupotasso, which means simply a lining up under or a ranking under. It was a military term. It means that we are simply aligning ourselves to God's design. We have to keep going back to the fact woman is made equally in the image of God, and that image is equally restored through faith in Jesus Christ. Women are not intellectually, morally, spiritually, or functionally inferior to man. She is unique from him, though, because God made them male and female and different. And it's different in the role that we play. We are to defer to our husband's leadership, protection, and care, and be a suitable helper for him, Genesis 2:20.
You two ladies, Abby and Kathy, as wives, what does it look like for wives to submit to this male leadership?
This is Kathy. In an ideal way, it's a situation, it would be working together as a team, talking through together a decision. But if the two don't come to the same conclusion, then the man has to make the decision, and I submit to that. I think what has helped me is understanding God's sovereignty in those situations where maybe I perhaps had a different idea of what it should look like, and maybe perhaps not have agreed with the decision. I can trust that God is in control of everything, even the unwise or the mistakes or what have you, because God is always working in us, and he's more concerned about crafting us, shaping us, creating us more into his image than what he is about a circumstance. And so he uses those circumstances to shape us, to child train us, if you will, so that we are becoming more and more like him. And so that gives you peace when you know that even in our sin-filled world, and we're trying to be glorifying to God in our decisions, even when we blow it or make mistakes, God is still using all those things to work together for good, like it says in Romans 8:28, for his glory.
I would, my answer is very much the same as Kathy's. It's definitely teamwork and conversation and talking and listening to each other. But yes, ultimately, if we don't agree on something, I submit to Adam and he makes the ultimate decision. But I find more and more that as we grow older and we know each other more and we grow in the Lord, there's less and less times where we disagree, where we're more in agreement, especially after praying and thinking about it and reading the Word together. Those times seem to be few and few. Not that we don't have disagreements, but when we do disagree, and I do submit to Adam, I see God's blessing through it. He blesses the decision that Adam makes. It may not always be perfect. In my way, it may not have been perfect. Of course, was not perfect. But there's definitely clarity and a surety that we did the right thing.
Just some things that stuck out to me about male leadership is that it really is teamwork. It's not just the woman sitting back and saying, okay, you do whatever. I don't need to be knowledgeable about it. It really is teamwork. Not only talking as wives to our husbands, husbands to wives, but trusting each other that we will be able to make the right decision, and especially wives trusting their husbands, that their husbands will make the wise decision and make the right decision for either them as a couple or them as a family. I think the other thing I wrote down was just saying a lot of times, again, when people think of submission, they think that the woman's voice isn't heard. And what we've seen here, not only with the teamwork and trust, is that the wife's voice is definitely heard, and it's definitely taken into consideration by her husband. And I think that's important to remember. I think a lot of women feel like they might not have a voice. And so remembering that even though you do submit to your husband, that you still have a voice and you still share your opinion.
1 Corinthians 7, 3 through 4 talk about how a husband and wife mutually belong to each other. I've talked about Ephesians 5:21 that all believers are to submit to one another. But here in 1 Corinthians it says, the husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. And so understand that we mutually possess each other, that we're supposed to mutually be serving one another in love, helps us, I think, understand how important it is to exemplify this beautiful relationship, which in Ephesians 5, Paul talks about, and this mystery is really an image or a picture of church and Christ, the relationship between Christ and the church. And so as Christ lovingly leads his church, he's the head of the body, that image that he talks about earlier in Ephesians, it becomes very important, it becomes very weighty when a man truly realizes that in his leadership to his home, to his wife and his children, he is supposed to be exemplifying Christ. And similarly for a woman, that we are to be responding to our husband's leadership as the church would to Christ, elevates it to a higher importance, not only to that unit, that family unit, but to the believers in the local body of church, and to the watching neighbors and extended family members that are wanting to see what does the fact that the Spirit of God living in you now as a believer, what impact does that have on you? And truly, to have this type of a God-exalting marriage can only happen because of the Spirit working within us. We cannot crank it out on our own. We can do a lot of things in our own behalf, but it's Christ who can work that miracle of grace and love and submission and leadership the way he wants it to be.
I think another point that I wanted to make on male leadership is that when there is male leadership, it's supposed to be male leadership when you are married.
Is there a time where you think there is a male leadership over you for those who are single?
I would say for me, because I'm a young girl, I would say the male leadership for me is to my father right now, especially being single, that my father is the man who has leadership over me right now until the day that he gives me away to my future husband, and that he is the one that I should be honoring and respecting.
And as a middle-aged woman speaking, I would say my male leader would be God. And after that, I would probably go to my pastor for advice or other women in the church.
Something really important to remember on male leadership, and part of the reason why our church has elected officials are men, is because we believe in male leadership in the church as well, in that the men are the people who should be leading the congregation. It does not mean that us women aren't able to lead in other areas. That just happens with other women or even the children. Kathy here leads our ladies' Bible study on Monday nights, and Abby and I are able to work with the kids, and all four of us are even able to help put together meals for Sunday brunches. So I think it's important to remember that just because we don't have official positions or elected positions, that we are still a very big and important part of the church, and that we still are able to be a leader in other areas.
I think that's why I like the term equal but different too, and not just only in marriage but also within the church, because sometimes there's that opinion of, oh, that's only for the woman to do. Oh, taking care of kids or washing dishes, that's for the woman. The men, the men's job is so much higher and greater, and they lead and they do this and they lead worship and preach, and that's not for women to do. Just remembering that everything equal, but there are different roles for each man and woman to fulfill in life, and God hasn't created each role for both male and woman.
I think remembering that there are things that we both can do together, even teamwork, right? But that in creating man and woman, God chose for us to have different roles.
I think what Abby was talking about here is good because, right, today, for example, after our fellowship meal, there was a man washing the tables, there was a man drying the dishes, there was a man vacuuming the floor, everyone pitching in to help serve one another. That's not a defined leadership role of who's helping afterwards for the fellowship meal.
No.
But for the leadership, yes, because that's God's design. He created that from the beginning. And when he established rules for the church in the New Testament, through his inspiration, and it is male leadership to exemplify a local body of believers.
Speaking on what Kathy said about equality and possession, husband belongs to wife, wife belongs to the husband, that's not in an abusive manner. It's in a respectful, loving manner, honoring one another just like you would honor God. Coming from a family that didn't have that male leadership and not that role model to follow by, it's very easy for the woman to think that she needs to spearhead everything, take control, and be the leader when they have never had that or experienced it. But now, learning more biblical truths and seeing how God is the head of Christ, Christ is the head of church, it is clear that this world could be walking a better path if that male leadership was actually exemplified in everyday life.
Each human being is created differently, and sometimes women have a stronger personality or more inclined to lead than men, and sometimes it's the women that need to take a step back to allow the men to step up and lead.
Yes.
Finishing up today's podcast, do you ladies have any resources that people could read or look up or look into that would be able to help them understand male leadership better and be able to maybe dive in more on some of the things that we said today?
I think I used this phrase before, equal but different. And there's a book that Alexander Strauch wrote called Equal but Different, and it goes into detail the different roles of men and women. So I would suggest that one.
I like that book, yes. And then another one is by John MacArthur. It's called Different by Design, Discovering God's Will for Today's Man and Woman. And he deals with these topics, and some of the notes that I had today were taken from that book. So both of those books I think are really excellent.
All right, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for listening to the podcast, and stay tuned for next week's podcast.